Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics and what is known as the Access Fellow here at Jesus College at the University of Oxford. Today we're going to be talking about the LNAT test, which is for prospective law students at Oxford, Cambridge and a bunch of Russell Group universities. I am involved in politics admissions at Oxford, so I do admissions for PPE, that's philosophy, politics and economics. But I have sat the LNAT test so that I can share the terrible mistakes I made with you so that you don't make the same mistakes, but also just to share some general tips on how to improve your performance on this absolute beast of a test, I think it would be fair to say. So let's dive in, let's see what we've got. So what is the test? Well, the test stands for the Law National Aptitude Test, or LNAT. As mentioned, it's used by a bunch of British universities. What does it look like? Well, you take it in a test centre on a screen. You have a little whiteboard next to you that you can take notes on, but you're primarily doing it at a screen, and it looks a little bit like this. You've got, for section A, some essays that you need to read, typically 12 essays, and 42 multiple choice questions you need to answer in 95 minutes, so that's pretty quick, and it'll look a little bit like this. And then for section B, you write an essay, and it will look a little bit like this, and you write in your essay in the provided box. Okay, but what does it really look like? Because how can you get a sense of how much work you have to do in 135 minutes? And this is a crucial thing to bear in mind. There is a lot to do, and you need to keep this in your head, because sometimes people freak out with the LNATs. They think, oh, I'm not very smart, I struggle with this because I'm not Oxbridge material and so on. No. It is just an absolute pig of a test. It's very difficult, it's extremely challenging, and a good performance is often getting somewhere in the realms of sort of 70% on the multiple choice questions. So just be kind to yourself when preparing for this test. Don't go in expecting to get perfect marks. But let's have a look at what a whole test looks like. This is all of the material that you would have to read in the course of just 95 minutes. So this is section A. You can see there's a lot going on here, right? And then you have to write an essay in 40 minutes after that. So there's an awful lot you have to do for the test. So what about the when and the where of the test? What about those details? Well, various important steps about this. First of all, set up an account on the LNAT website from the 1st of August. All of these details are on the Oxford University website, by the way, so if you're not sure, you can also find it on lnat.ac.uk. Step number 2, register with a test centre. So there's 500 in the world, but 150 in the UK. The sooner you register, the more likely you'll get a test centre that you will find convenient. So especially if you are in a more remote part of the country or the world, then being sure that you're close to a test centre that will be appropriate for your needs is going to be important. So don't dally when it comes to registration. Check those details soon. Okay, book your test, register by the 15th of September and take the test before the 15th of October for Oxford and Cambridge. I believe the deadline is a bit later for other universities. Pay for your test. It costs £75 for UK EU students. But there are bursaries available from the University of Oxford, so check out the Oxford University website. If you just search for LNAT Oxford online, you'll find all of those details. We don't want your inability to potentially pay this charge to stand in the way of you making a competitive application to Oxford, so check out the bursaries and whether you're eligible. Also note that if you're typically in receipt of access arrangements, so for example, I wouldn't be able to take this test on a screen because I'm half blind. If you have extra time in exams as a matter of course, then go back to step 1 and fill out an examination access requirements form. Again, the sooner you can do that, the better for you. So just make sure you're on top of those logistics, because you don't want to be stressing about that when you're also trying to prepare for the exam. How should you go about preparing for the test, and how do we actually use the test in Oxford? Well, this is something that I tend to stress with regards to all admissions tests, is that you deal with the 3 Ps, and those are physiology, psychology and practice. Okay, so physiology, this is a grueling test, 135 minutes, which is 2¼ hours. You have to read a lot, you have to think a lot, it's very tiring. And so the person who is better rested, better fed, more hydrated is likely to do marginally better than the person who is tired, hungry and thirsty. So look after yourself physically, because it will return in terms of a better performance. You know, to a significant extent, this is just a test of your resilience, of your stamina. It's not a test of how smart you are. So getting used to working at that sort of intensity consistently and without falling off because you're crashing as a consequence of not having eaten enough, or because you had a very strong cup of coffee before and you're beginning to tail off it towards the end of the test, and so on. Just be very careful with how you look after yourself. So that's the physiological preparation. Psychological preparation, it's a really hard test, so don't go into it expecting to get full marks, because you won't in all likelihood. And don't go into it when you start to struggle with questions, think that this is a barrier for you. You can't possibly succeed in this. The test is hard. It takes resilience. It takes perseverance. Don't say no to yourself. Just keep putting one foot in front of the other. Okay. And the final P is practice. This is a test of your skills rather than your talents. It's not to do with your natural abilities. So the more you practice it, the better you will get. Okay. There are lots of practice resources on the Oxford website and on the LNAT website. Okay. In terms of how to practice, I would suggest little and often. So yes, it's a good idea to do one timed exam, and you can do that on the LNAT website well and easily. But generally speaking, good practice would be to do a few questions in little batches, maybe every few days. You can also practice just by reading stuff that's relevant to the course. So it could be case law, for example, and just getting used to thinking critically about the stuff you read. That is also good preparation. Be sure to spot the differences in any piece of writing between fact, opinion, and judgment. So quite a lot, especially in section A of what you might be dealing with, will be negotiating between those three phenomena. So when someone is stating something that is factually accurate versus when they are then extending those facts into an assessment or an argument or an opinion. And then finally, when they're trying to pull the facts and arguments together as a conclusion or a judgment. So let's take an example from the specimen paper from 2010, which is on the Oxford website. And that opening paragraph, this is the first essay of 12 essays that you have to read in 95 minutes. So it says, traditional medical oaths and codes prescribe a physician's character, motives, and duties. Now that is a statement of fact. So this is not someone expressing their opinion. That is a truth. I mean, I suppose we could have some debate as to whether or not that's exactly what they prescribe, but nonetheless, this is not a particularly controversial statement of what someone believes is the truth. Okay, but then the sentences delve almost immediately into opinion. Typically, they, the oaths, portray ideal physicians as devoted to the welfare of patients and to the advancement of the medical profession and medical knowledge, responding compassionately to the suffering of patients, humbly mindful of the limits of their curative powers and the harms they may unintentionally cause. So how are we supposed to know that this second sentence is more a statement of opinion rather than a statement of fact? Well, they utilize quite a lot of adjectives and adverbs, which is usually a signal that someone is trying to advance something that they're trying to persuade you of, and where there is a degree of ambiguity and uncertainty rather than clarity. And so let's just sort of see some of those adverbs and adjectives in work. Typically, they portray ideal physicians as devoted to the welfare of patients and to advancement of the medical is technically an adjective but not ambiguous here, profession and medical knowledge, responding compassionately to the suffering of patients, humbly mindful of the limits of their curative powers and the harms they may unintentionally cause. And even that modal verb may is also ambiguous. So where you can see someone starting to hedge their bets with slightly more fluid and ambiguous language, that's suggestive of someone who's advancing a persuasive argument rather than laying out some clear black and white facts. Okay? And then the final sentence of that opening paragraph, the Hippocratic injunction, strive to help, but above all do no harm, is the ruling maxim. That is that's a concluding statement, that is a judgment. Okay, so we've got all three elements in this one paragraph. We've got a statement of fact, we've got a statement of opinion, and we've got some judgment, which is trying to meld the facts and opinions together. How do we know that that last sentence is a judgment? Well, if you could, without grammatical error, add the word therefore to the start of a sentence, then it is a conclusive sentence. It may not be the conclusion, but it is starting to round off some arguments. So if we try that, therefore the Hippocratic injunction, strive to help, but above all do no harm, is the ruling maxim, does make sense, and so you know that that's a judgment sentence. Okay, just getting used to differentiating between fact, opinion, and judgment in anything you read is going to be helpful preparation for the LNAT. Okay, so what does a good performance look like on LNAT? Well, for section A, it depends on the university that you're applying to. Roughly 26 out of 42 would be good for the Russell group. I say roughly because it depends on how well the cohorts do each year. So if in one year the cohort generally does better, then you'll need a slightly higher score. And conversely, if the cohort generally does slightly worse, then you need a lower score. But averaging out over a few years, 26 out of 42 is typically a good performance. Okay, and 29 out of 42 is typically good enough for Oxbridge. So that's about 70%. So remember what I was saying about managing your expectations carefully. If you are doing well at A-levels, then 70% would be a relatively low mark typically for someone who's used to getting A's, A stars at A-level. So don't go into this test expecting to get the same sort of percentages right. For section B, that's the essay. Again, it varies by university what is expected. The essays are marked in-house, so they're marked actually by tutors at the university, and we mark them according to university criteria typically, meaning that the highest grade you can get at Oxford is anything of 70% or higher. That's a first. Anything between 60 and 70% is a 2-1. So you'd be doing well for Oxford if you're getting into the mid to high 60s. Now again, getting something like 65% in an A-level might be quite severely disappointing for someone who's getting towards the start of year 13. It'd be a relatively low mark for many of you. So that's why you've just got to recalibrate your expectations and not expect to ace everything, because it is hard. How do we actually then use the test? Well, here's a quote from Oxford. Tests give us an extra piece of information for every student who has applied for a given course, wherever they are from. Considered together with the other elements of the application, this helps us to identify the very best candidates. However, there is no specific mark that will guarantee that you will be invited to interview. So this is important. We use the tests holistically, so we don't just use the test. It's not like there's a strict cut-off mark that you have to get in order to be considered a competitive applicant. The tests are nonetheless a good predictor of who's likely to be invited to interview, so the better you can do, the better it will serve your purposes. The tests are particularly useful for comparing students across the world, and law attracts applicants from many countries. It also provides a relatively clear line of sight for us to you, the candidate, because other factors on your application like personal statements and even school qualifications can be affected by the people around you and how much support they've given you, whereas a test you take on your own on the day does tell us quite a lot about your resilience, about your capabilities, about your depth of just willingness to practice questions, all of which can be very reassuring if you perform well. Okay, so do take the test seriously, is important advice. So as for section A, that's the multiple choice questions. There are resources available as mentioned on the Oxford website and the LNAT website. During section A, you can go back to your answers up until your 95 minutes is up, so you can skip a question and come back to it. I would, however, advise against that because you just don't have enough time. You've got to read and digest and comprehend 12 essays and answer 42 questions. The likelihood that you can, in all seriousness, come back to a question earlier in the paper, then reread all of the relevant material and then answer it again seems kind of ambitious, if not downright impossible. So it's better to guess at an answer. You're not going to be penalised for an incorrect guess, so I would advise you guess and assume you're not going to be able to come back. If by some miracle you do read all of the 12 essays and you do have oodles of time to go back to it, great, but that seems like it's not likely to happen. Okay, sections A and B are timed separately, so once you've switched over from section A, your 95 minutes for section A are up and your 40 minutes for section B begin, you cannot go back to section A. So don't sort of assume, I shall take 135 minutes for section A and then just write a one-word essay. No, you can't do that. Okay, you can have a little whiteboard to write notes on, and it's a good idea to do so, to record specific words that you want to keep in your memory, and also for planning your essay for section B. You can't, of course, sort of doodle on the screen, and you can't take paper notes because you can't take them away with you. Okay, the remaining time for the section you are on will appear in the top right-hand corner of the screen. All right, so specifically for section A, let's have a look at a past question. So this comes from the second specimen paper, which is on the Oxford website. And you've got this big old essay that you need to read about the teaching of literature. Okay, now you absolutely don't need to know anything about the content of this. So if you're not sure what any of this is about, that's absolutely fine. Also, you'll note pretty quickly that it uses quite advanced and complicated language, quite long words. You don't need to be on top of all of the vocabulary either, so don't panic if you're not sure what all of the words mean. This is intentionally meant to be quite stretching and challenging to read, but we do have many students who don't have English as a first language who successfully navigate this test. So stay calm, you'll be fine. Don't, think the worst of yourself. Manage your own psychology and you'll do much better. Okay, now one of my tips I have for section A, and you can take this or leave this, this is not the advice, this is just some advice, is actually not to read the whole essay before you've read the questions. So here are the questions. The reason for suggesting as much is because what you're likely to do is to read that big long essay, then you'll read the questions, and then you're going to have to read the big long essay again. Whereas if you read the questions first, you kind of know what you need to be looking for. So if we take this first question as an example, which of the following is an assertion of fact rather than opinion? Remember, we're trying to differentiate between facts, opinions, and judgments. Well, if we have a look at some of these things first of all, then when we're reading the text, we can kind of be alert to what we need to look for. It's a bit like if you were a detective at a crime scene and you know the crime you're investigating before you go into the crime scene. It kind of helps you target your observations, doesn't it? So reading the questions before you read the text is likely to be quite time efficient. Bear in mind that if you've got to answer 42 questions in 95 minutes, you've basically got 2 minutes per question and about 8 minutes per essay. It's really not very much time, so you're going to have to be pretty slick. Okay, so if we look through some of these options, yes, there is a better way. Well, better there is an adjective, so that seems to be a statement of opinion. So I think even without reading the text, I can probably dismiss that as not a statement of fact. As Matthew Arnold noted, that could be a statement of fact. Literature cannot be divorced from life. That seems to be a statement of opinion. You cannot understand it until you have some personal understanding of the men who wrote it. Again, that seems opinionated and argumentative rather than factual. And finally, what these great men have done is to hand us a great patrimony. Again, that seems quite sort of opinionated and argumentative. So actually, without even reading the text, I can tell that the answer is likely to be B. Obviously, I will check it with the text, but hopefully you could see that by reading the questions before the text, you get a bit of a head start. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing. Obviously, go and find the specimen paper yourself and have a think about what the answers are likely to be. But once we've read the questions, we can then read the whole text. Now, I'll be honest, I found that first question relatively straightforward, and some of the questions will be slightly easier than others. And indeed, the whole test is not particularly challenging if you had all the time in the world, but you don't. So you kind of just need to get used to being awfully time constrained. This second question I actually got wrong, in all honesty, because in trying to do it under time conditions, it was a bit ambiguous, bluntly, as to who the audience is. It doesn't tell you exactly. So the question is, this passage is an extract from a speech. To whom do you think it was originally delivered? Was it students, parents, politicians, lecturers, or writers? Well, I was certainly sort of weighing up whether or not it could be politicians or lecturers. So because the reason I thought it might be politicians is because it does make reference to cabinet ministers, to the House of Commons, it even references the Senate. But it became clear, having learnt that I got the question wrong, that it was actually referring to lecturers, because although it mentions politicians, it mentions them as if they are not present, rather than that they are present. And when it talks about a Senate, it means a Senate House, which is a governing institution in a university. So, you need to be pretty sort of keen-eyed for detail, because the differences can sometimes be quite subtle. Anyway, the correct answer was lecturers. So which of the following does the writer imply but not state? Well, the answer to this one is that literature is created only by men. Again, that's fairly easy to find out from the text, but if you know you're looking for that discrepancy before you read the text, then it just makes things a little bit easier. And then finally, the claim that the French language is purer than English does not come up in the text, and so that is relatively easy to find. But as I say, it's easy if you've got 10 minutes, 15 minutes per essay. You've actually only got about 8 minutes per essay, so it is really slick. Hence why getting a mark of something like 29 out of 42 is good going. Okay, so time management is crucial. It's something you've got to be careful with, something you've got to practice with past papers and just getting used to. But the more you try these comprehension exercises, the better you will get, okay? And the quicker you'll be able to do it. All right, section B is an essay. It looks a little bit like this. You tend to have several choices. Don't get hung up on a question that you are familiar with. In other words, something that you know lots of stuff about. You're not going to be rewarded for knowledge. You're going to be rewarded for presenting a clear argument. Okay, so the rules you need to follow are that if you fail to plan, you should plan to fail. In other words, if you write an essay just off the cuff as a stream of consciousness, it will be barely comprehensible to your audience. The tutors in the universities will be marking these essays, and they will have a fat stack of essays to get through, so they will be reading your essay fast. And by fast, I mean probably at most sort of 3 to 5 minutes each, okay? And so if you can hold their hand from start to finish of that essay, they will love you for it, because most students, I'm afraid, don't plan what they're going to say. And so there isn't a nice, neat sequence of points that they're making. There's just a jumble of thoughts and facts thrown in all over the place. So the clearer you can be, the better. Even if you take up to 10 minutes of planning and 30 minutes of writing, the quality of your writing will be so much greater that the fact that you write less will not be a problem. This is very much a case of quality trumps quantity, okay? The second maxim that you need to take with you is that you should answer the question, the whole question, and nothing but the question. Now, there are a few elements to this. First of all, answer the question means don't sit on the fence, right? Imagine you are a lawyer in court and you're trying to defend a client. The worst thing you could do would be to go up to the judge and jury and say, well, I kind of don't know if my client's guilty or not guilty. I'm still making up my mind. That's absolutely useless, right? Lawyers have to be definitive. They have to come down on one side rather than an argument. That's not to say that you should just deny the power of an opposing argument. Indeed, you should engage with opposing arguments, but not engage with them in a sense of, ooh, I'm still trying to figure it out. Ooh, not sure I'm going to tell you. Ooh, big secret. No, you need to be clear. This is my argument. And yeah, there are some other arguments that are interesting, but here's how, with respect, I'm going to defeat them. Because that way you convince much more of your audience, right? If your audience is sitting on the fence and you're able to just nudge them off by saying, I know you're looking on the other side of the fence, but let me show you why you should look over here. Oh, you're so much more powerful, right? But for goodness sake, please answer the question. Don't kick the can down the road and say, I can't resolve this one, someone else will have to do it. That's useless. No one's going to pay a lawyer to come to a sort of mushy, indeterminate conclusion. So don't do it. All right, answer the whole question as well. So make sure you're very fastidiously focused on the question wording. Don't you dare use synonymy. In other words, don't sort of take the question wording and then just start going off on tangents using stuff that's vaguely connected to the question. You've got to use the question wording so that it shows you're focused on the brief. Again, if you're a lawyer and you start just substituting words in and out in a sort of fluid fashion, it shows ill discipline and sloppiness. If you've been given a particular question, you answer it in a focused way, right? You don't want to be like a politician on TV who, when asked a difficult question, starts to sort of just pivot and answering subtly different questions. You want to be laser focused. Indeed, one of the best rules of thumb is that you should be able to answer the question in the opening line of the essay using the essay question wording to frame your response so that there's no ambiguity that you are answering the whole question, okay? And answering nothing but the question just means stick to the brief, don't go off topic. Okay, you should also be a lawyer with the language. Lawyers make money out of language. That's pretty much exactly how they make all of their money, by parsing indeterminacies in what words mean. And so you can have some fun with this. This is your opportunity to show off what you can do with the language that is offered to you in the question. So for example, this essay question, I'll talk you through how I might plan this. The internet and instant communication technologies are profoundly changing our world for the better. Do you agree? So first of all, when you're planning your essay, identify what I would call the hook word. This is the word upon which you need to hang your argument. This is the word upon which everyone who's debating this topic needs to focus their attention. This is a bit like not guilty in a criminal trial, that prosecution and defense are going to focus everything on that concept of not guilty. That is the whole debate, basically. And in essay questions, there will be something similar, some focal point that you need to identify. The way to identify it is to just answer the question with as few words as possible. So if I go back to the question, the internet and instant communication technologies are profoundly changing our world for the better. Do you agree? Imagine answering that with as few words as possible. I might say, yes, it's for the better, or no, it's not for the better. Can you see that word better jumps out as the crux of this debate? So what better means is something that we need to dig into, right? We can also, however, play with the words profoundly and changing. We can have a bit of lawyerly fun about that. We can show off our focus and our linguistic adaptability by having some fun with those words as well. We are going to consider some synonyms for better, because what we're going to do is to deconstruct what better means into sub-points that we want to talk about. But what we're not going to do is to then, once we've got those synonyms, never use the word better again. No, no, no. I'm going to put the word better in every paragraph, right? Because that's like saying not guilty. My client is not guilty. She's not guilty. She's not guilty. I have to keep hammering it home if the judge and jury are going to pay attention to me. Same deal in an essay. The word better needs to come up pretty much at the beginning and end of every paragraph. It is changing the world for the better. It is changing the world for the better. It is changing the world for the better. Okay? But I'm going to explore what better could be deconstructed into. And so I might say that something's better if it's more just, if it makes the world a better place because people have more access to power, for example. And I might also define better as more efficient, that if something is better if it utilizes fewer crucial resources, or it uses resources in a much more efficient manner. Okay? So those are the ways that I might split up better into nice, neat, separate points that I want to talk about. Okay, now what case are you going to make? When you're planning your essay, obviously you've got to work out what your conclusion is going to be. What is it that you're going to finally say? I would be tempted to argue in agreement with this essay. Now, the reason is not because I believe that, but because I think it would show off my skills to the greater extent. Now, this is an important thing to think about. A lot of the time people are concerned how to answer an essay because they don't know what they think and they're still grappling with it in their mind. It doesn't matter what you think. Okay, this is not a test of whether or not you are right on about the pressing issues of the days. This is just a test of how you can construct an argument. So you might be better off just thinking about this like you're entering a debating competition and someone has said, here, you need to debate against this motion. And you might be thinking, oh, but I kind of don't want to debate against that motion. I kind of agree with it. Doesn't matter. You're just practicing your skills. Do the same in this essay. You don't need to be emotionally invested in the conclusion. You don't need to believe it. What you need to do is to show off your skills. And so the reason I would be tempted to argue in agreement with this case is because certainly in 2025, we might be slightly cynical of the value of the internet and communication technology. In other words, there's a pretty strong narrative going around that it's causing a lot of harm, whether it's with regards to, all sorts of dangers towards democratic backsliding and undermining electoral integrity, to undermining economic stability, to facilitating criminal activity. There's lots of ways in which we can see that instant communication technologies and the internet are pretty toxic and damaging in 2025. And so it might be easy to say, oh yeah, it's not changing the world for the better. But I don't want to make my life easy. I want to show off. I want to be the sort of person that turns up at Great British Bake Off and makes a cake out of something that sounds gross but actually turns out to be delicious, right? So I'm going to construct an argument that's going to be convincing, but is also going to be a little bit more hard work because it'll be a better argument. Not in the sense that I will believe it, but it'll just be stronger. Okay, it'll show off more skills. And it'll also make you more memorable if you're not the 100th person arguing exactly the same thing as everyone else has been arguing. Okay, so here's how I might structure an essay. Start with an introductory paragraph which directly answers the question. Don't mess around. Don't answer the question in the final paragraph. Answer it in the first sentence, right? Remember, if you're pleading in a court to the judge and jury, you don't want to be sort of ambiguous and a bit wishy-washy as to what you're trying to claim. You want to be absolutely clear from the start. This is the case I intend to make. This is the conclusion I will reach. And you, dear jury and judge, will be coming on this journey with me. Okay, so the introduction clearly answers the question, ideally using the question wording. So I'd want to see the words better, I'd want to see the word profoundly, and I want to see the word changing in your introduction when framing your answer. Okay, the introduction also needs to sketch out a roadmap, which is just where you state the points you intend to make and the order you intend to make them, so that it's clear from the start where you're taking your readers on the journey to. The second paragraph would define terms, so things like what better means, what profoundly means, what changing means. This doesn't mean I'm going to dump those words from then on. I'm going to keep repeating those words, but at least I've given some flesh to their bones because they're pretty ambiguous terms and they could do with being pinned down. Okay, my first major point is going to be defining better as something that's more just, and I'm going to talk about how the internet and instant communication technologies have given more people access to power and information and networking capabilities that historically they would never have had access to, and therefore I think that it's made the world a bit more just. It's distributed power. My second point will be that the internet and instant communication technologies have made the world more efficient in allocating key resources quickly. And then I'm going to deal with some counter arguments. So I'm going to acknowledge that some people would argue actually that the internet and instant communication technologies today are causing all sorts of threats to politics, economics, crime, and so on. And I'm not going to deny those are threats and challenges, but I would say that on balance, I would still be inclined to conclude that it is profoundly changing the world for the better, even though there are risks and there are unquestionably dangers. So I'm going to acknowledge counter-arguments. I'm not going to just pretend they don't exist, but at the same time, I'm not going to let them defeat me. Okay? And then finally, my conclusion will just repeat what I've said as a summary, but it will also perhaps draw out some implications. So what does my conclusion mean for the future? If I say that the internet is changing the world for the better, what does that mean in terms of where we're heading from here? What does that mean, for example, are we expecting a linear change? Are we expecting that the internet will continue in a sort of neat way each year to make the world better? Or could it start to plateau? Could it start to go in sort of up and down motion? What are the implications of what I'm trying to say is something you could also draw out in a conclusion. Okay, so that's a basic structure, and that would work quite nicely for a Section B essay. So, having considered Section A and Section B, where should you start? Well, start as soon as you can, would be my advice. You know, there's no time like the present. You don't want to mess around. You do need to practice quite a lot. Obviously, if you've got exams in the summer before your university applications, then you should prioritise those, because having good grades is very important for universities like Oxford. But if you can start to look at past papers, if you can start to get yourself psychologically prepared, that's a good idea. Obviously, looking after yourself and making sure that you take care of your physiology, the sleep, the eating, the water, you can do that straight away and should do that straight away, regardless of whether you're taking this test. Okay? When you run out of past papers, you can buy LNAT test papers on Amazon, so there are past papers there. But you can also just read books, magazines, or case law and start to differentiate between facts, opinion, and judgment. Start to get used to just critically distinguishing between those parts of speech. There are some books recommended as well on the Oxford website if you've got the capacity for them. So, for example, the Peter Gardner book, New Directions, Reading, Writing, and Critical Thinking, is particularly useful for those of you that don't have English as a first language if you're trying to prepare for the LNAT. So there are some of those resources as well. But there it is. I hope that's been of some help. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. You obviously show the extraordinary resilience and perseverance of someone who's going to smash the LNAT. But I think the crucial takeaways are: look after yourself, be kind to yourself, and just practice. Don't look on this test as anything more than a test of your perseverance, because that's pretty much all it is. And if you do persevere, if you do just keep putting one foot in front of the other figuratively, then you should absolutely ace the LNAT. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you've got any questions, I will endeavour to answer them as quickly as possible. But thanks so much for watching. I wish you all the best. Bye now.